All right, friends, this Zero to Hero Governance and ALM mentorship session. Today we have my friend. I'm not sure if it's too late, Will, but Will is up, and it may be nighttime where he's at, but he's here, smiling. So he's on. He's gonna talk about a topic that I don't think it's discussed a whole lot in the market, but I think it's an important topic. Essentially, what we are going to talk about today is how do you handle data, especially lookup data, for your implementation when it comes to ALM. How do you control the information from your lookup tables that have to translate from environment to environment as you develop your application. So, well, thank you so much for dedicating time for it. The floor is yours, and everyone enjoy it. This is gonna be really good, really, really good. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Let me start by sharing my screen. All right, hopefully you can see my screen now. Let me know if you can't. So yeah, thank you, Victor, for the introduction. Really excited to be here today. I think you are right. This topic is not very widely discussed, and I haven't actually spoken about this topic before. So when you gave me the opportunity to come to this series and discuss this topic, I was very happy to prepare some content and share some of the things that I've learned about data working in some of the previous projects. So yeah, hopefully you find some of this stuff interesting today, help you with some of the projects that you are doing or you will be doing in the future. So here's the agenda for today at a high level. So we're going to do a little bit of introduction about data. And then we're going to talk about some of the data workflows, some of the tools you can use for data, and then how you do apply that in pipelines. I will leave some time for Q&A in the end. So let's get started. So before I start, in case you don't know who I am, I'm Wael Hamze. I'm a Power Platform lead and business applications MVP. I've put in this page so you can reach out to me if you've got any questions after this session. Feel free to ask your questions, obviously, during the session, but if you want to stay in touch on some of the posts that I do sometimes on LinkedIn or YouTube, you've got the links here. Okay. So let's talk about data. So data is very important thing in Power Platform, and the data is probably one of the most valuable things to organizations. So you can see all of these low-code capabilities like BI, apps, automate. They all rely on some data, and from Power Platform's point of view, the DataVerse is probably the main storage mechanisms for data. I know you could create apps that connect into SharePoint and other bits and pieces, but from a Power Platform perspective, when it comes to ALM, we're primarily going to focus on DataVerse today and how do we work within DataVerse, and as Victor mentioned, how do we handle these lookups. That's going to be the focus on the topic today. So let's start about DataVerse. So let's talk about storage. Just going to do a little bit of introduction to data. So DataVerse has different types of storage. So we start with the database storage. So this is where all your tables, relationships, metadata, all this kind of stuff is. So typically you would have a table for every kind of table or record, and then you would have relationships between these and all the metadata around what's happening that is stored in the database. And then you have file storage, which handles things like attachments, photos, videos, images. And then you've got the logs, which kind of handles things like the audit data. So these are the three different storage mechanisms. When it comes to pipelines and data, we're primarily going to focus on the database part, but it's good to be aware that if you need to handle files for any reason, these are normally stored in other storage mechanisms. So let's talk about data types, because different data types you may want to handle differently. So the first one is metadata, and what I refer to by metadata is like when you define your tables and you define your forms and views, So this is all metadata. So that's one type of data that you want to handle in your pipelines, and that's probably the part where most of you are probably familiar with, because that's typically handled by the solutions. And then we have configuration data. So that's the data that allows you to configure each environment based on different scenarios. So this is things like environment variables and maybe some other configuration records. Again, you need to be mindful about that when it comes to pipelines, because this is something you'll need to handle because the data in here will be different between environments. Then we have reference data. So reference data is basically the data, things like lookups, which typically doesn't change very often. And typically the data is more or less stable between different environments. So this is probably the data that your transactional data will rely on. So that's the next type of data. So that's the business data. So this is typically the data that business users or users of the system will be entering. So if you're entering a contact in the system, that's business data, for example. If you're entering an activity, that's business data. And then finally, we've got audit data. As you'll be doing actions within the system can, if enabled, store audits about what you've done when. So that's another type of data as well. So the purposes of data, I think, we've got some data in the development environment, for example. So when you start building functionality, you want to test it. So you've got some data just so you can build the actual thing. When you deploy something to the test environment, you want to run different scenarios. So typically you may have different data for different scenarios. And sometimes you will have an environment where you want to give it to somebody like a UAT user, and you don't want them to start from scratch. So you could deploy some sample data in there, so just get a feel for what it looks like. And that's typically very useful when you have demos. And finally, you've got also production data, which is the actual data that's in the live system. So when it comes to DevOps and pipelines, you may have to handle all of these different purposes in your pipeline. So you may want to deploy test data to a test environment, sample data to the demo environment, and maybe some even data migration or reference data to production. So this is all things that you have to consider. And finally, I'm just going to mention, because this is something that often gets overlooked, but data sensitivity is important. So typically, every organization may have different ways of defining this, but you could have public, which is data pretty much available to everybody outside of the organization as well. Then you have general data, you have confidential and highly confidential data. So when you're thinking about moving data between environments or deploying data to environments, or getting access to data or managing data within pipelines, you need to be mindful of the sensitivity of that data. For example, you wouldn't want to store credentials in GitHub or some sensitive business information in GitHub. So it's just good to know, when you're handling data, what's the sensitivity of the data, and make sure it's handled appropriately, during your DevOps process. So that's a good introduction to DataVerse. So I'm gonna talk about the data types and how it affects our ALM processes now. So this is pretty much just a summary of the previous slide. So if we talk about metadata, for example, that's required from an ALM perspective. It's typically not changing between environments, and it is solution aware for most of the things, I would say. So this type of things is pretty much more or less handled by the solution. So you export solution, import a solution. The configuration data is required during the ALM. This is the data that varies between the environments, so things like environment variables. And again, this is handled by the solutions. For example, environment variables you can handle by, you can change, you can, move the environment variables like we're using solution, then you can apply specific values in pipelines later if you need to. And then we've got reference data. So you need reference data. You need this to be part of the ALM process. And then this typically doesn't change between environments, and it's typically not part of the solution. So this is something where you need to have a solution for, because it's not part of the standard solution. So this is something I'm going to be focusing primarily on today. And then we've got the business data, which is, you may want this in the ALM solution, because as we mentioned, like test data, sample data, data migrations stuff. So you may want to consider it as part of your ALM process, but maybe in some cases you don't. This data will be different based on the environment that you're targeting and is not solution aware as well. And finally, the audit data, basically, you don't need to worry about audit data because the audit data is designed so you can't actually change it. You don't want your audits to change if, as you move across. It is very different based environments, and you don't have to worry about that from a solution perspective, apart from enabling the audit if you have to enable it, but that's a separate conversation. Okay. Let me show you some data, because I've been talking about data for some time now. So I'm just gonna show you some actual data that we're gonna be handling today. So I've got my dev environment here, and it's got some records in here. So this is probably something everyone's familiar with. So it's a list of different foods. So this data is going to be, I would class this as business data, because the amount of data that you can create about foods is unlimited. So every food has its own code, category, and some description around the information. If I drill down further, for example, into the asparagus, you can see that we're starting to see some lookups in here. So for example, I can see like this is the food category, which is vegetables. So if I go into that, then that's a lookup. So that data is not going to change very often. It's got a code, it's got a parent as well. So again, we've got a relationship here to the parent. And if I look at related records, for example, as well, I can see what that food is made up of. So if I want to see how much protein, for example, is in 100 grams of asparagus, I can go into the details in here as well. So that's drilling down further, and then you see another lookup. So that's another record in here. So protein is a category, and it's got its own code and type and how you measure it and stuff like that. So you can see we've got a mixture here of reference data, and we've got a mixture of business data. So this is one of the tables where it stores reference data, so all the information about what foods are made up of. And we've got the food categories in here, which is another table which has got a parental relationship. You can see some of them are blank. So with this kind of scenario, you wanna be able to move that data from one environment to another, and you want to be able to do that consistently, because things like these records, they're not going to change. I mean, the chances of coming up with a new protein is quite slim, and it's not going to happen very often. So this data, once you load it into an environment, is going to be more or less stable. Some of the other stuff like food is going to change very often. So let's go back into the demo. So it's not that one. Okay. So in terms of the Power Platform development, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but typically, we've got different types of people interacting with Power Platform. You've got citizen devs, pro devs, other stakeholders, and you've got pro dev capabilities working with Visual Studio, and citizen devs working with like the Maker portal. So when it comes to data as well, you will have different people contributing to data. So you want to make sure that you've got the right experience for the right type of user as well. And this is constitutes the Fusion teams. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of progress through this presentation. So when it comes to moving data, I'm going to talk today a little bit about the configuration migration tool. So this is a tool that's been around for a very long time, and basically it allows us to move data from one environment to another. And the ALM capabilities around this have been improving over time. So I'm going to show you some of that stuff today as well. But essentially what the configuration migration tool allows us to do is you have a source environment which contains some data. The first step is basically you want to decide what data you want to move from one environment to another. So the way this happens is you create a schema file. So a schema file is like an XML file, which basically defines the entities and attributes that you want to move across and how they relate to each other. So things, you can decide the tables, columns, mappings, all this kind of stuff in here. So once you've got some environment and you've got a schema file, then what you can do with the configuration migration tool is basically you can export whichever data you want, and you can basically what that gives you is a data.zip file, and the data.zip file contains the data, which is one XML file, and another schema file, which is the same schema file that you've provided. But so once you've got the zip, then you can do a number of things with it. But typically, what you would do, you would import it into another environment, which is your target CRM environment. So that's normally how the workflow works. You put in some data in the source environment, you create a schema, export it, and import it into the target environment. So I'm just going to show you a quick demo of how this tool works at the moment. So the first thing is you want to create a schema. So if I click on next, it's going to ask me to log in, obviously. So just give me a moment until I type in my password. Chosen shorter password for this demo. So let's connect into the dev environment. So once you're in the dev environment, you can, it will list you all the solutions that you have. So you can select whichever solution that you think your data is in, and you can basically configure the entities and attributes. One thing you can do with the configuration migration tool is you can load an existing schema. So if I go in here and I load an existing schema, for example, let's go into the reference data. So I've got a schema in here already that I'm going to walk you through. So remember the nutrients and the food categories that I showed you before. So basically, I've added these into the schema, and these are the list of fields that I want to move across. So basically, it's basically just the names and the codes and some descriptions. So one of the things you can do with the configuration migration tool is you can configure the import settings, which basically lets you decide how do you want to compare the data against the target environment. So if you have the data that is already there in the target environment, you have an option to decide how you match against it. So for example, by default, it will match by name. But for example, if you wanted it to match by code, so if you find a product, for example, with the same code, you don't want to import the same product, you just want to override or update the existing product, this is what you can do in here. So once you got that schema, basically you save it in an XML file. And the next step would be to basically export that data. So I'm just gonna, in this case, just override that file that is already here. Yeah, so the next step would be to export the data. So basically, you just need to decide where to store the file. In this case, I'm going to store it in my other folder, which is, let's say, demo. Let's just delete this file from here, and then let's create a new file. So let's export the data. So basically, it's going to run very quickly. It depends on how much data you have, but in this case, I don't have probably got less than 200 records in total. So once it does that, then the data is exported. So let's go into the folder and show you what happens. Basically, you get the data.zip file, and it's an XML file basically, which has got all the data in one file, and then you got another file which contains the schema. So basically, it gives you a zip file with everything, and then what you can do after that is you can go back into the configuration migration tool, and then you can continue, and you can do the same thing. Basically, you can connect. I'm not gonna do it now, but I'm just gonna show you what the options are. Let's do the password again. Okay. So you select a different environment, and it basically asks you to select the file. So once you select the file, it will basically import that data into that environment. So yeah, today I think the topic is around ALM and pipelines. So I'm not gonna go ahead with that for now, and we'll do that once we using pipelines in a second. But basically, I just wanted to demonstrate you've got the tool. If you don't have pipelines or you don't have time to create pipelines, you want to move data from one environment to another, yeah, you can just use that tool. Before we move any further, I'm just going to go into the environment. And let's assume we want to create a new record in here. So I don't know, let's call it 0 to hero. And then let's just, let's say we have, yeah. So I've created a new record. So that's going to be in my dev environment now. So if I move this data to another environment, this record should come to the other environment. So let's continue through the presentation. So I've showed you how you can do things through the UI. Now, if you want to start doing automation, then one of the ways you can do it is using the Power Platform CLI. I know there's a lot of information and sessions that you've probably seen about the Power Platform CLI, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about the Power Platform CLI, but one of the capabilities that it allows you to do is basically manage the configuration data. So there is a pack data, and if you're working with portals, there's another feature that it has which basically manages portal data. So this one, with this one you can move your own data, you can define the schemas and everything. This one is kind of dedicated for portals. So if you create a portal, you can export it, download it, publish it using this tool as well. So let's just do a quick demo just to show you how this is working. So if I go into my PowerShell interface, if I do pack data help, it's going to basically show us the different operations that we can do with the data. So if I want to export data, let's see what the export looks like. So basically, again, similar to the work that we've done through the UI, we've given it a schema file, we tell it where the data file should be, and then we select the environment that we want to export the data from. So I've got a few commands that are saved here just to save you and save myself some time. So if I want to export the data, basically all I have to do is just say export. This is the schema file, and this is where the data is going to go, and this is the environment. So once I click on that, basically it should export that data for me. And then now I've got the ability to basically import the data if I wanted to. So let's go back to that demo folder in here. So this file has been updated, I think, just now. So if I go into the data file, you should see lots of data in here. But if I search for 0, you can see there's a new record that's been added here, which is called 0 to hero. So the data is now in the zip file. And if I really wanted to, I could execute another command, which is basically import the data. I'm just going to show you how it looks in the interface, but I'm not going to execute it. So basically, you got pack, data import, and then you specify the zip file that we just exported, and then you specify the target environment, and that will handle the import for you. But I wanted to show you as well how do we do it with pipelines. So that's what I'm going to focus on in a second.
Hey, Will, I got a quick question for you. It was actually a question from the chat here.
Sure.
Someone asked if there are repos where we can find the schema for first-party apps, say, the schema for customer service, including SLAs, things like that, like Excel schema files that are based on out-of-the-box fields for first-party apps. or do you build your schema every time?
I've not personally seen a schema file for specific like third-party apps. I've seen like schemas for portals and things like that, but I've not seen like for third-party apps, like, I don't know, like if you want to export SLAs and some case-specific information. I've not seen that, but it's a good idea. I think it could be an idea for like an open source project to put that on GitHub and let people contribute.
I think it was first party apps we meant. I mean, for example, customer service. At the back end, there is customer service admin center. So there are KB articles, unified routing and SLAs, etc. So those settings for Microsoft first party apps.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
I'm
not aware of. Sorry.
Don't quote me on this, but I think I remember that being part of the common data model. And I know there is documentation on common data model schemas. I don't know if they are, how directly related are the schemas in Dynamics 365 or any first party app for that matter to those common data model schemas. But that was a massive project that Microsoft was engaging it with SAP and some of the top industry providers. I would have to go back and look at the common data model, but I will see if I can find the documentation that they had on that before the end of this presentation and post it here. It might be what you're looking for.
Yeah. And if there isn't, Gushan, I think this would become a repo that a lot of people would tap on if that is something you'd like to start. I don't know if I said third-party apps, but it's first-party apps. If I made that mistake, I wanted to correct it now. But it could be first-party app schema or maybe functionality like you suggested, Gushan, SLAs, KB articles. That would be great. It would be a great asset to have available. Anyhow, sorry, Will.
No, definitely. That's very good discussion. Yeah, I totally agree. I think having some schemas that you could start with, and then you can change them if you need to for your requirements. I think it would be really good. All right, let's continue. So we've covered the Power Apps CLI. So let's, I've done a demo already. So just some notes about the configuration migration tool. These are some things that I've noticed, when I used the tool in the past, based on my experience. So obviously it's free. It's part of the SDK. You don't need any development skills to use it. It does take care of relationships. So if you've got records that are linked together, it will process them in the right order. It's got some good ALM capabilities because you can, do it via the CLI. You can do it via PowerShell. You can even do it using the package deployer as well. You can define, the keys in terms of how you match the data. You can even disable plugins, which is something that is useful to do. If you've got a plugin firing, on import, you don't want to trigger when you import the data. You want to trigger it maybe later down the life cycle. And especially when it comes to sample data, sometimes you want the sample data, for example, to show things like trends or activities in the last week or whatever that may be. You can actually move the dates when you import the data. So they're kind of more or less based on what you expect. In terms of some of the downsides, as you've seen, it generates one big XML file, or actually a zip file, which contains a one big XML file. So when it comes to version control, it's not the best thing because imagine you've got thousands of records, and every time someone changes something, it's going to go into that single file, and in a lot of cases, the data in there is not sorted. So you add a file, you add a record, and and then you add another record, and it's going to be difficult to see what's changed and what's not changed. If you're dealing with large number of records as well, I've noticed that it reprocesses all the records, so it will take time to import the data. And if you've got failures, you have to go in the logs. There isn't like a table which shows you the rows and whether they succeeded or failed. You have to go in the logs, and it takes a bit of time to find out what went wrong. I wouldn't recommend it for huge amounts of data. And sometimes it doesn't support all of the out-of-the-box entities. I mean, this is something that I've had some challenges with in the past. Things may have improved now. And finally, it doesn't support deletes. So if you've imported a record and you want to delete it because it's no longer part of your reference data, typically the advice would be in this case is to either kind of deactivate it, because then it's no longer kind of visible. And then you can potentially have like a bulk delete job if you really want to get rid of these records. I think it doesn't delete basically because you may already have relationships, so you may want to keep the data, but you've got some workarounds there if you need to. I'm just going to walk you through some tools today. So one of them is the XRM CI framework, which does some PowerShell, which is a PowerShell module that offers some additional capabilities when it comes to working with data. And then you can also have some additional build tasks, which are provided by the Power DevOps tools. So again, there's reference data in here. So there's a number of activities that you can do with reference data. So I think that there are now some build tasks that work with portals, but I couldn't see ones that work with just reference data yet. So I'm going to show you today in the demo how you can handle some of the reference data using the Power DevOps tools. So let's get into the demo. So let's have a look. So one of the things that I like to do, for example, is instead of having one single file, it's useful to split the data into different files. So basically, there is a script which is part of the toolkit, which basically you give it an environment and you give it the schema file, and what it will do is it will basically extract the data into a single data file, but after that it will take the data and it will split it into multiple files. So, and that becomes very useful for version control. It doesn't just do that, it also sorts the records every time, so you will always kind of see things in the same order. So basically you get a file, you split it into multiple files. So if you only make a change to this table, you should only see a change in version control against that table. So that's quite useful. So if we go back into basically the script in here, and we do export, and then we choose the environment where we want to export from, it will basically do the same thing that the pack CLI was doing, but it will use the PowerShell module and it will then convert the data into different files. So if we go back into the here, you see this file, which is the food categories. I haven't touched, but I've touched actually the other file, so I can actually see all the different changes. So if I go into my changes, I can actually see that the date on this file has changed. You can see it's just the date that has changed, which is the data you've exported. But I can actually see that I've added a record into this file. So that's useful from a version control perspective, because now I don't have to worry about, because if you need to approve a change, for example, which I'll show you in a second, it's very difficult to know if you just get all the changes in one big file. So let's show you how that works in pipelines as well, because that's the main topic of the conversation today. So let's go into the repo. So I've got a branch that I've already created yesterday called 0 to hero, and it's got all the data. So at the moment, you can see it's got the reference data in here. So if I go into data, you can see it's got all the different files in here. So the idea is that I take my changes from the dev environment and push them into this branch in here, basically. So I've got the data and version control. So you could do it like I've showed you. You could execute a script and you could commit that script, but that experience may not be ideal for everybody on the team. So what I've done here is I've created a pipeline which basically does all of that. So all I have to do is just run the pipeline. I select the branch where my data's in, and sorry, let me move this icon. Then yeah, I execute the pipeline. So while this pipeline is executing, I'm just going to show you what it's doing. So it's actually quite simple. So the first thing is you add the tool installer, and then you use a task from the Power DevOps tool, which is called export configuration migration data. So you give it a connection string, which is basically either application secret or username and password with OAuth, and then you specify the schema file. So I've already stored my schema file in version control, so I can track changes to the schema over time. And then I specify where I want the zip file to be created. So all this task is going to do is just basically take that schema and then generate a data.zip file. And they've got another task after that, which basically takes the zip file that I've generated in the previous task, and it extracts the data into version control. So by default, it would just extract it as one file. But if you've got some additional options in here, so it can either sort the data and it can split the data into multiple files. So once I do that, I basically run a PowerShell script, which is all it's doing really is basically checking out that branch and then adding the files and creating a commit and pushing that commit. Fairly standard Git commands. It took me a lot of runs on this build to get it right, but eventually it worked. And then finally, you want to create a pull request. So you specify the branch and the target branch that you're doing and some comments in there. So when this build runs, it will basically export the data and generate a pull request for you. Yeah, you can see how many times it took me to get this to work another day. But yeah, so this has succeeded now. So you can see everything is well and good. So if I go back into my repo and I look at pull requests, let's do active pull requests. I can see reference data changes in here. So if I click on that, you can see that on the files, you can see there's two files that have changed, and you can see this is what makes the splitting the files very useful, because now if somebody's reviewing this request, they can see that this person has changed this table. So even if I had 50 tables as part of this package, I can see that this person changed this table. So I don't need to worry whether they've changed anything else. Imagine you had like changes in 5 tables and you had to review this, whether the changes are right or wrong. It would take you a very long time. So this one, you can actually see that we've just added one record in here. So that build is now basically ready to be. So if I want, I can actually push this build into the master branch. So if you want, let's go ahead and do that. I'll push it into the master branch. And then we can complete the request. I think there's another build that I triggered that is failing on the same branch. So we're going to have to do without completing this pull request, but I'll show you what's going to happen anyway. So once you basically get the changes into the master branch, you could now package that data. So let me run the pipeline again. So I'm going to package that data. So instead of running on the master, which I was intending to, I could actually run it on this branch as well. So let's package the data from that branch and run this build. So the first build was basically taking changes from environment into version control. This one is just going to take things from version control and generate a package. So this one is fairly straightforward. So all it's going to do is basically we tell it where the files are, which is basically this folder. And all it's going to do is just basically generate the data.zip file. And then I tell it to combine the files. So if you've decided to split the files, you can actually combine them using this task as well. So it basically does the reverse of the other task. So So this should run fairly quickly because it's just acting on version control. It should just package the basically the data from version control. Okay, almost done. So this is done now. So if you see the artifacts now, you should see that there is a data.zip file that's containing our changes that's been generated. And finally, once we got that package, then I want to release this data to another environment. So I'm just going to create a new release. I'm going to push it, let's say, into the build environment. Yeah, let's just do that. Let's just create the release. Okay, hopefully this will start soon. Yeah, it's running. Sorry. Let me show you what's happening while it's while this is going on. So yeah, once we've got the data.zip, again, there's another task which basically imports the data. So again, all you need to do is connection to the target environment, provided the zip file, which was from the previous build, and you've got a few more options in here. If you want to map users from one user to another, you want to run things in batches, do things concurrently. If you want to custom directory for logs, you can do that. The logs are very useful because if something goes wrong with the import, you can basically the logs get uploaded as part of the build log, so you can actually go and download the logs and see actually which record failed and why, which is quite useful because otherwise it's very difficult to debug. So let's go back into the release and see whether it's imported the data or not yet. So you see the data has been imported. I'm just going to show you quickly because we haven't seen the log. It's basically processing all the data. It's telling us that it's matching all the different records in here. So yeah, so looks like things went in as expected. Just trying to see if our record is in the okay. All right. So that's the data basically imported into the next environment. And then if I go into my build environment, so this is where the data is it's coming. So I can refresh. So you can see the data's being updated, today. And you can see our 0 to hero record is here now. So that's been imported today. So so basically the import worked. Basically, we just were able to move the data from one environment to the other. So that's a very useful way. If you've got data, you create a schema, and then you transfer that data into version control if you want. You can automate things using pipelines, and once it's there, you don't have to worry about it. The good thing about the configuration migration tool is things like lookups. Sometimes you will need to create workflows or other things based on actual lookups. So for example, if you want to create a dashboard or something based on this specific record, or some process based on this specific record, you want the GUIDs to be the same in both environments. And one of the good things about the configuration migration tool is that it maintains the GUIDs of the source environment. So if you've got a dev environment, you create your processes in there, you move it to another environment, it will maintain the GUIDs of these records if you want. Okay, I've got just a few more slides to cover before we run out of time. So let's go back to the deck. So I'm just going to talk about data flows. I think I've covered hopefully enough information to get you started, at least on the configuration migration tool. There's another feature in Power Platform which is called Dataflows. So Dataflows is very powerful. Basically, it works on data sources, and it works on a number of different data sources. So you can use DataVerse, you can use files, you can go to Azure, SaaS, PaaS capabilities, other third-party products. I think it's got like at least 80 data sources. So basically, if you've got data in any of these data sources, You can transform that data using a data flow, and what it uses the Power Query language, and then you can do some really powerful transformations with the data. And once you're done with your transformations, you can then import the data into the target environment, which is DataVerse in this case. So, so why am I telling you about Dataflows? Because it's very one of the things is very easy to use. It's very easy to transform data. If you're working with a configuration migration tool, you're basically taking data from DataVerse into DataVerse, so you haven't got any ability in the middle to do anything. But imagine you've got data in a legacy system and you want to move that into DataVerse, even if it's reference data, then this tool will allow you to do some transformations in the middle. So what you could do, for example, let's say these food categories that I showed you that were coming in a spreadsheet from another system. So what I could do actually is I could use the data flow, process that spreadsheet, put it into DataVerse, and then, for example, use the configuration migration tool to move that data from DataVerse into another environment if I wanted to. So just some notes about DataVerse, Dataflows, sorry. So it's included with Power Apps, BI, and Customer Insights. So if you've got these licenses, you're already covered. It's very easy to use, similar to the configuration migration tool, but it's got the advantage of having Power Query, so it can do all these transformations for you. And you can kind of utilize other data sources, not just DataVerse, but you can import obviously data into DataVerse, and you can add the data flows into the solutions as well. On the downside, I think the ALM capabilities for data flows still have some limitations, so you need to reconfigure things once you kind of take something from one place to another. It doesn't integrate very well with version control. Like you can't, for example, pick up something or push something into version control, so you need to worry about that separately in addition to your data flow. This one is actually, I'm not sure, I think I left it here by mistake. But yeah, ignore these last two statements. I think I probably pasted the wrong slide. But yeah, I think it's quite useful. So I'm just gonna show you a quick demo, just to give you a feel of what that looks like. So if I go into my the maker environment, for example, if you want to handle food categories, let me just edit this data flow. So you can see you can, for example, take an Excel file from a specific location. Then you can do some simple transformations on it. You could this one is fairly straightforward. But once you do your transformations and on your data, you can then basically decide how that data maps into some of your DataVerse tables, and you could execute this and it will import the data into your DataVerse environment. And one of the good things about it is, you get very useful like log details in terms of how many records were processed and updated, and which rows failed, etc. So it's quite useful. So so let's just leave some time for Q&A in case you've got any questions. So any questions from anyone?
I don't think I see anything on the chat. I think most of the questions were already answered. But I got a quick question. Well, have you ever run into a scenario where you had to automate the generation of the schema files? For example, you are under development and some of those tables change, maybe daily or weekly. Have you ever had to automate the schema generation itself, where you just write a script for, I don't know if there is a tool under the CLI to generate these files, but have you ever run into a scenario where you had to write code to automate the generation of schema?
That's an interesting question, as usual, but I've not come across in a scenario where you would want to automate the generation of the schema file. And And typically, because in most of the projects that at least I worked with, there was some processes around change control. So you had to go through some change processes, like, yes, you add a new attribute or you add a new table, but somebody needs to review that, decide that this is actually needs to be moved to the next environment, because it's not always true that if you add a new attribute or you add a new entity that you want to take it across. But if you had that requirement and you wanted to make your life easier, then obviously you could, I'm not aware of a tool, but I'm sure you could query the metadata APIs of DataVerse, and basically you could start with your schema file, query the metadata and DataVerse, see whether any of the columns or tables were added, and then update your schema file, extract the data automatically. It's doable, but I've just not come across a scenario that at least I would need it for the projects that I worked on.
I see. All right. I'm not sure if anybody else has questions. If you do, you can unmute yourself and go for it in the next maybe 10 seconds before I stop the recording.
Hi, Will. I think I've got a question regarding portals data deployment.
Yeah.
So what would you suggest as the best or a recommended or best practice or recommended way to deploy portals data? Because I think there is many more than one way. So,
do you have any concerns, for example, around using the Power Apps CLI to deploy portal data? Have you found any challenges with it that you would think that?
No, not necessarily. Okay, so there is portal CLI, you can do it in this data configuration migration tool, etc. So in your opinion, so what do you recommend?
In my opinion, I can't tell you that I've worked a lot with portals to kind of tell you that I've migrated lots of things, but if I was to kind of give a recommendation, I would say the Power Apps CLI is probably the tool that is kind of most regularly updated from the product team, and it's got the portals capability in there. So I would expect that it's a tool that you could use it and it will stay probably up to date based on the changes to the portals and everything like that.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I think there are some there's also a kind of Power Platform build tools task, I think, for portals, I think, which uses the Power Apps CLI. That kind of gives you additional confidence that it's the kind of a stable platform to use. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Makes sense. Thank you.
So the CLI, I think, is the best bet, because then you don't have to worry about generating schemas and all that. There is a set of tasks for DevOps for portals, and there is one custom pipeline, I think, developed by Arpit Srivastava, where he does a lot of portals migration. So yeah, that's a good one to use. It's a great tool.
Yeah, if you probably search on YouTube, you'll probably find some video around Arpit doing something with portals and stuff.
I think there's loads from Victor, Arpit, Oliver.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Victor. Thanks, Wael.
No problem. You're welcome.
No problem. So let me stop the recording for now. Well, thank you so much for this. As always, that's stellar content. Really appreciate your time. Next week we have Wael again. He's gonna do an advanced Power Platform Azure DevOps pipeline discussion. It's going to tie in with Mariano's intro to pipeline, so it's gonna be great. So see you all next week. Let me stop this recording.